we've now finished up our list screen, which is a great little example of our flat list component. Now, before we move on to our next screen that we're going to put together, I want to do a little bit of busy work or a little bit of administrative work on our application. So at present, we have 3 different screens worth of content that a user can see. But right now, there's no way for a user to navigate between these different screens. If you open up your app.js file, you'll recall that inside of here, there's an object with a initial route name property. And that property right there decides what screen is going to be visible when our application first starts up. Right now it's set to list. If we change it to home, it's going to now show this home screen. So if I now save this, the default screen that we see is the home screen instead. So in this next series of videos, I would love if we figured out a better way to show all the different screens that we're putting together, so that we do not have to always be changing this prop right here or this property anytime we want to show some different content. So to do so, I want to turn that home screen into kind of a different experience. When our application first boots up, we should always show the home screen by default. But at the same time, on the home screen, I want to add in 2 different buttons. One button a user should be able to tap to go to the component screen, and a user should be able to tap this other button to go to the list screen. So pulling this off is really going to be 2 different steps. The first thing we're going to have to do is figure out how to place 2 buttons on our home screen. We're going to have to figure out how to detect whenever a user taps on either this button or this button. The second thing we're going to have to do is figure out how to actually navigate a user from the home screen over to components or list. So that's what we're going to work on in this video and the next couple. So the first thing we need to do, like I said, we need to show some buttons on the screen. Now showing a button is going to be a little bit more complicated than you might think. Let me tell you why. In the world of React Native, if you take a look at the documentation, you'll see that there's actually 2 different ways of showing a button to a user. There's one primitive element. Remember, a primitive element is something that we import from the React Native library, and it's called button. This primitive element, as you might guess, is going to show a very simple button component. This has very little customization features tied to it, and essentially it's just going to show something that a user can tap, and it has the ability to tell you and I as developers whenever a user taps on this button. The other element that we have access to make a button is something called touchable opacity. This is a very customizable primitive component, and it allows us to essentially detect a press event, or like a user tapping on something, on just about any kind of element inside of our application. So that could be like a piece of text, or an image, or just about anything else. So we've got a button component for very simple interactions, and a touchable opacity for kind of like more complex interactions. Just so you know why there's these 2 separate things, it used to be in earlier versions of React Native, there was only this touchable opacity thing. But a lot of people were coming into the React Native world and saying, hey, how do I show a button? Because the name touchable opacity doesn't really make it seem like it's a button at all, right? So eventually the React Native team kind of caved in and said, okay, we'll create a very simple button so you can show a button, but there's not going to be a lot of customization options tied to it. So that's why there's these 2 different ways of showing a button to a user. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to work on our home screen, and we're going to try to show a button using that button primitive and the touchable opacity primitive as well. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.